So how safe are we now with new variants being reported around the world, the latest being dubbed Omicron XE? Let's check in with Professor Salim Abdool Karim, who is the director of the Centre for the AIDS Programme of Research in South Africa, and of course South Africa's former top ministerial advisor on COVID-19. Prof, it's always a pleasure to have you. Thank you for being with us. My first question is, can we now all relax and hope that COVID-19 is not as fatal in future as it was in the past, or do you think we can see a scenario where the state of disaster has to come back, in fact?
Good evening, Francis. Good evening to all of the viewers. Yes, I think it's a good time to relax because we currently are at a very low level of transmission, and we can expect that that will continue at least for another few weeks. But if past trends continue, we can expect that we will see a new wave, and probably sometime in around early part of May, but that depends on whether there's a new variant. And as we know, this virus continues to spread, continues to mutate, and so we should expect that there's a reasonable likelihood that there'll be a new variant and a fifth wave. So we can't completely let down our guard. We can do so right now because we are in low transmission, but we need to also prepare for an upcoming surge of infections. And so that's what this is about. We are going to have to learn to adapt to the way in which this virus spreads. We adjust our restrictions and we adjust our behavior according to the levels of transmission.
There are new variants out and about, BA1, BA2, and now talk of XE. Can we hope that, like Omicron, they seem to become more transmittable, but not necessarily more fatal? Or really, do we have to be concerned that anything can happen? Do you know anything about XE you can tell us?
Just very little about XE. I've just seen the latest data. It clearly is transmitting faster than BA1 or BA2. And so it is likely we will see small blips in terms of new infections with XE based on what's going on in the UK right now. But one must be very clear that when you get infected, when you get a wave of infections, as we got with Omicron BA1, that we have in our population a fairly large number of individuals who've been exposed, and we have individuals who've been vaccinated. So those individuals have some immunity to this particular variant. So our concern is not about Omicron, it's not about Delta or minor variations on Omicron. Our concern is about the next variant, and that variant will be named Pi if the WHO follows the alphabet. The next letter in the Greek alphabet after Omicron is Pi, capital letter P, small I. And we expect that when Pi eventually emerges, it will transmit faster. It will have a certain level of immune escape from natural immunity and probably even from vaccine immunity. But we expect that our vaccines will still hold in terms of preventing severe infections. What we don't know is this new variant Pi going to be more virulent? And that's a difficult question to answer because we don't know what the mutations are. And we've seen from Omicron that there can be many mutations all at once. So we have to remember we are still living in the midst of a pandemic. The next variant could be anything. We don't know. We hope it's going to continue the trend of Omicron and be less severe. But that's just hope. That's not what the facts are.
Professor, we've discussed before that even though there is vaccine hesitancy in South Africa, there's fortunately this very high level of natural immunity. Do we know now roughly how long that lasts for, though?
So natural immunity lasts for about 3 to 4 months before it wanes. But there's two parts to natural immunity as there is to vaccine immunity. I think it's very important that we clarify that individuals who have had natural immunity have much less protection to infection than individuals who have had natural infection plus vaccines. So any individual who's been infected with any of the variants of SARS-CoV-2 in the past should go and get a vaccine, because the protection that a vaccine gives a person with past infection is 82% higher protection than if you've had just past infection on its own. So past infection is not a solution. You need to have a vaccine in order to get the kinds of antibody protection that's needed to prevent new infections.
All right, then, Professor, this new phase now that we're talking about, that's a phrase used by government, by the president, but looking at the regulations that would fall under health now, some critics are saying it's exactly the same thing, it's just under a new department, which is health. In case you haven't had a chance, and for our viewers, let's just look at some of them. It would stipulate that there could still be social distancing, there could even be mandatory vaccinations, mandatory quarantine, limit on the amount of people that are allowed to gather, funerals still remaining at 100, and vaccine certificates to enter or exit South Africa. Are those still valid in terms of the debate around our rights being restricted? Is it scientifically valid to include things like I've just outlined?
So I think at this stage, the correct step was to ease our restrictions, and given that most of the restrictions are no longer needed under low transmission, ending the state of disaster was the correct move. We could perhaps have done it earlier, because at the end of Omicron, which was at the end of February, we could have eased the state of disaster. But we have to remember that we have to have the tools in order to deal with what is to come. So let's, for example, plan on the basis that the Pi, the next variant, happens to spread fast, puts a lot of patients into hospital. We need to have the tools, the regulations, in order to protect our population and to reduce the burden on our health services. Now, that does not mean that the regulations all need to be implemented at once. Let me give you an example. Under the state of disaster, we could have a curfew, but a curfew was only implemented at certain points. The fact that we could do it is what is important, and that's what the regulations need to do. The regulations need to provide the government with the ability to implement certain behavioral changes should they be necessary. Doesn't mean that they have to implement them all the time, but they have to be there as something that they can use.
The new regulations talk about sharing advice when it comes to curfews that you've just mentioned, or restricting the sale of alcohol, for example. So those are two very contentious issues. Presumably a state of disaster would have to come back, because sharing advice is not taking a decision. It doesn't sound like the Department of Health will have that authority. But I'd love to know, how is the scientific community feeling about the effectiveness of curfews that we've seen in the past, of alcohol sales being cut back? There was some research saying it didn't really matter unless all alcohol was restricted. Anything new that you're hearing?
I think with many of these, we learn that they have initial effects, but when you keep using them repeatedly, they lose their benefit. And that's quite important, that we don't overuse or keep using the same tools, because then people get used to it and they work around it. So I'm not sure about what the next variant is going to look like and what restrictions we're going to need. I doubt we're going to need, a restriction that would involve alcohol or curfews or so on. But should they be necessary, the government has a state of disaster that it could call upon should the situation be so dire. And up to that point, I think we need to have some basic behavioral changes and public health measures that will enable us to deal with any new variant that's likely to come. And those are just simple things. They are relating to indoor environments, ensuring we mask indoors, ensuring that indoor areas are restricted to vaccinated people, ensuring that we control the risk in major mass gatherings. So those are the basic elements that are needed. Everything else is only needed should the need arise. It's not needed at this time and may not be needed even in the next variant.
So these are tools that can be taken out of a toolbox, but they are sitting in the toolbox of the health minister going forward. So I'd like your final opinion. I mean, one of the debates throughout the lockdowns, throughout this pandemic, has been whether government has used its powers wisely, whether it has been responding to scientific, hard and fast scientific evidence or not. Just your take on that. Do you trust government to trust the science here and health to take it forward and use that health scientific rationale when necessary? So when government needs to act, it's got to call on various sources of advice, and scientific advice is the one that I give. And I'm very clear about our role. Our role as scientists is to step back and ensure we provide the best evidence. If the government chooses to follow it, that's its prerogative. If the government chooses not to follow it, it's also its prerogative. I'll give you an example. I did an analysis of all the advisories, 114 advisories that the MAC submitted to the minister in the first year of COVID. So in the 1 year, we submitted a lot of advice. And it was interesting that 81% of all the advice we gave was fully heeded. And that is a good sign, I think. Now, not all our advice was heeded. For example, advice we gave on taxis was not heeded, and there were certain things we gave that were not heeded. But I think that's part and parcel of the trade-off. I think we need to ensure that we have good scientists who give good advice, and it's up to government to follow that advice. And if they don't, they have to recognize that they have not followed advice and take the consequences thereof. Going forward, this is still declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, but it's no longer seen as a disaster in South Africa. It sounds like, from what you're saying, we're still in an uncertain place. I mean, how long? Is it 6 months before the WHO thinks of saying this isn't a pandemic, or before we say, okay, it's not getting worse, so maybe we are now starting to live with COVID-19? Is it all simply up in the air, or looking into your crystal ball, can you see a beginning of an end?
Oh, I would be a rich man, Francis, if I could predict what the future looks like in COVID. The reality is that we don't know. We are living in uncertain times. We have some information that guides us as to what likely scenarios may occur, but we don't know what that future holds. I think it's fairly safe to assume that the pandemic will be with us for at least a little while. 2 years, 3 years, I don't know. But if we are thinking that it's going to end in the next few months, that's a very ambitious thought process. I would say we need to be ready to accept that this is going to be with us for a while. And remember, the bats, the horseshoe bats from which this coronavirus comes, they have thousands of other coronaviruses. And they are just in a position where you've seen with the first SARS, with MERS, and now this, that we could be sitting with another pandemic on its way at some point. So we have to figure out how to deal with pandemics, not to panic, to deal with it scientifically, carefully, ensure we adjust our behaviors, but also that we have the tools to deal with any major threat should it emerge.
All right, a strong argument against wishful thinking. Thank you so much. That was Professor Salim Abdool Karim, of course, former ministerial advisor, the top one in the country, and now director of the Centre for the AIDS Program Research in South Africa.